The sun was setting low across the horizon when the man turned his truck down the gravel road that led to his farmhouse. The golden light washing over endless rows of crops. His 3,200 acres stretching as far as the eye could see. Land that had been in his family for generations. Land he had worked with his own hands, season after season, sweat dripping into the soil, the hum of tractors echoing through the fields. The quiet pride of knowing he was keeping something alive that his father and grandfather had once protected. He parked the truck near the front porch, dust swirling around the tires, his body tired but his spirit content, until his eyes caught sight of something unusual taped to his front door. A thick packet of papers sealed with an official-looking stamp. His heart tightened immediately, a cold unease creeping into his chest. He climbed the steps slowly, pulling the packet free, flipping through the pages. His stomach dropped as the bold words jumped at him. Notice of transfer of property ownership, community enforcement. His eyes scanned faster, his hands trembling. The HOA claimed his entire 3,200 acres had been repossessed by the association for violation of community contracts. His heart pounded louder, his jaw clenched, his eyes darted to the signature line. It bore Karen's name, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. He staggered back a step, gripping the wooden railing of his porch. A rush of disbelief washing over him. How could they even try? Something this insane. His farmland wasn't part of their subdivision. It wasn't a backyard garden. It was acres upon acres of registered farmland. Land with deeds and history older than the HOA itself. He flipped through more pages. The words twisted with legal jargon, accusations of non-compliance, claims of improper land use, violations of environmental bylaws that didn't even apply to farmland. They had built a story out of lies, forged a net of nonsense to make it look official. His fists shook, his chest burned with anger. But beneath that anger was a sharp fear. He thought of his family's history. The blood and labor poured into this soil. The barns, the fences, the irrigation channels, all of it threatened by a group of arrogant neighbors led by one power-hungry woman. He sank into a porch chair, the papers heavy in his lap, the evening air now suffocating instead of calm. He remembered his grandfather's voice telling him stories of how the land was bought with sacrifice. How the family nearly lost it once during hard times but fought to keep it. Now here he was, holding papers that claimed it had all been stolen in the name of an HOA contract he never signed. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a neighbor's text flashing on the screen. Heard the HOA filed a takeover on your land. Karen's bragging at the clubhouse, saying it's done. His breath caught, his vision narrowing, his worst fear confirmed. It wasn't just a trick. Karen was already spreading the lie as truth, turning the community against him before he even had the chance to respond. He stood suddenly, pacing the porch, running his hands through his hair, anger spilling over into determination. He wasn't the type to bend. He wasn't the type to let go, especially not of something this big, not of the land his family had bled for. He stormed inside, slamming the packet on the kitchen table, pulling out his old wooden box where he kept every deed, every record, every tax receipt for the land, stacks of yellowed paper carefully preserved, maps drawn in his grandfather's handwriting, contracts signed decades ago with county officials. He spread them across the table, his eyes scanning the details. This was proof, undeniable proof. But how could Karen think she could erase all of it with a few signatures? The arrogance stunned him. But it also revealed her mistake. She thought she could bully and bluff her way through. But he knew the law better than she expected. He grabbed his phone again, calling his attorney, his voice tight. I need you to look at something right now, it's urgent. Within an hour he was sitting in his lawyer's office downtown, the packet of HOA papers laid out on the polished desk, the attorney's sharp eyes scanning each page, his lips pressing into a thin line. These signatures, these dates, this is fraudulent, absolutely fraudulent, he said finally, his voice firm. They don't have jurisdiction over farmland. These bylaws only cover residential lots. And even those require consent. This is nothing but a power grab, but they've filed it in county records, and that means they're serious. The man leaned forward, his voice low but hard. She's trying to steal everything my family built. She wants to erase me from my own land. The lawyer nodded grimly. Then we'll fight, and I'll make sure the judge sees what she's done. But you need to prepare yourself. Karen won't stop. She's the kind who thinks rules don't apply to her, and she'll drag this out until you crush her with facts she can't escape. The man left the office that night with fire in his chest, the packet clutched tight in one hand, his own deeds tucked under his arm like a shield. As he drove back to his farmhouse, the moonlight washing over his fields, he felt both rage and resolve. The HOA had declared war, and Karen thought she had already won. But she had no idea who she was up against. She had no idea that by targeting him she had awakened a man who would use every ounce of patience, every shred of evidence, and every drop of his strength to not only defend his land but to make sure the people who dared to steal it would regret ever signing their names on those forged papers. He stood on his porch again, staring out at the vast farmland stretching into the darkness, his fists tight at his sides, whispering to himself, "This land is mine, and no one, no Karen, no HOA, no forged contract, is ever going to take it from me." The next evening the man drove to the community hall where the monthly HOA meeting was being held, the packet of fraudulent papers tucked under his arm, his stomach tight with anger but his face steady. As he walked through the doors the noise inside fell to a hush, heads turned, whispers spread like wildfire. Some neighbors looked at him with pity, others with curiosity. But many already had the smug look of people who believed Karen's version of the story. At the front of the room Karen sat. Like a queen, her hair perfectly styled, her lips curled into a proud smirk. Beside her sat two board members, their eyes darting nervously as if they knew what was happening was wrong but were too afraid to speak. Karen banged the gavel lightly against the table, her voice loud and triumphant. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending tonight's meeting. We are here to discuss a matter of great importance to our community. I am proud to announce that the HOA has successfully reclaimed over 3,000 acres of farmland that was being misused and neglected, land that now belongs under our care." Gasps and murmurs filled the hall. Some people even clapped, stunned by the audacity. The man stood near the back, his jaw tight, his fists clenched at his sides as Karen continued, her voice dripping with arrogance. "For too long this land was left outside the community's vision. It was a waste, an eyesore. But now, thanks to the hard work of this board and my leadership, it will finally serve the people. Imagine the possibilities, new homes, parks, revenue for our community. This is a victory for us all." She spread her hands wide as if expecting applause, and some neighbors gave it nervously. The man stepped forward then, his voice booming through the room. "That land is mine, it was never yours, and it never will be." Silence cut through the hall, every head turned. Karen's smirk faltered for a split second but then returned, sharper, colder. "Ah, there he is. The man who refuses to accept progress. You've had your chance, but you broke community standards, and now the land belongs to us." He pulled the packet from under his arm and held it up, shaking it for all to see. "This right here is nothing but lies, forged signatures, twisted words that mean nothing in the eyes of the law, and every neighbor in this room needs to know that Karen and her board are trying to steal what they do not own." The crowd buzzed, people shifting uneasily, some whispering that maybe he was right, others frowning, unsure who to believe. Karen slammed the gavel again, her voice rising. "Order, order, do not listen to his nonsense. He is trying to divide us. He is trying to keep all that land for himself when it could serve hundreds of families. Do you think one man deserves more than 3,000 acres while the rest of us fight for space?" She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing at him. "No, he doesn't, and that's why the HOA acted." The man stepped further down the aisle, his voice firm and steady. "That land was bought and paid for by my family long before this neighborhood existed, before you ever thought about your precious bylaws. You think you can steal it because you enjoy pushing people around with fines and threats. But this isn't about weeds in a yard or paint on a fence. This is about theft, and theft has consequences." Some people nodded, others looked shocked. Karen laughed suddenly, the sound sharp and cruel. "Consequences? You're the one facing consequences. You're the one who's finished. Soon you'll be the one packing up and leaving while we decide how to use our new land." The man felt his chest burn with fury but he held it back. Instead he stared directly at her, his eyes locked, his voice low but powerful. "Keep laughing, Karen. Because when the truth comes out, it won't be me who's leaving, it'll be you, and this entire community will see you for what you really are." The silence that followed was thick. Some neighbors exchanging uneasy glances, Karen gripping the gavel harder than before, her knuckles white, her false confidence cracking at the edges. The man turned and walked out without waiting for her response, the door slamming behind him, leaving the hall buzzing with tension, the seeds of doubt planted, the first cracks in Karen's empire beginning to show. The man left the meeting hall with his jaw tight and his steps heavy. The night air felt colder than usual, but inside his chest, Burned like fire, he knew Karen would not stop. She was too proud, too drunk on power to let go of something as big as 3,000 acres. And if he didn't act fast, her lies would spread deeper into the county offices, maybe even twist into something harder to fight. The next morning he woke early, skipped breakfast, and drove straight to the courthouse downtown. The old stone building loomed over the square, its tall windows catching the morning sun. Inside, the halls echoed with footsteps and the faint shuffle of papers. He walked straight to the records office, a place he knew well, shelves stacked high with files, clerks typing behind desks, the scent of old paper thick in the air. When he gave his name, the clerk frowned slightly and disappeared into the back, returning with a thick file. She slid it across the counter and said, "These are the latest filings connected to your land." His stomach dropped, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the file. And there it was, a set of documents stamped and signed as if the HOA had full authority over his farmland. His eyes scanned the pages quickly, his heart pounding faster with each line. False claims of violations, fake signatures, bylaws stretched far beyond their legal reach. Then he saw it. A signature that was supposed to be his, scrawled across a page dated months earlier. But the handwriting was wrong, jagged and uneven. His name twisted into something almost right but clearly false. His chest tightened with both rage and relief. It was fraud, plain and simple. Karen had forged his name. He looked deeper, spotting dates that didn't line up, notary stamps that looked suspicious, even entire pages copied from old contracts and pasted into new ones. Sloppy work dressed up to look official. He took photos of everything, his phone clicking steadily as he documented every lie. Then he asked for certified copies. The clerk hesitated, whispering softly, "You're not the first to have trouble with this HOA. But you're the first to catch them this bold." He nodded grimly, stacking the papers neatly into his folder. As he left the courthouse, he felt both the weight of betrayal and the spark of hope. Karen had overplayed her hand. Her greed had pushed her into outright crime. And that would be her undoing. Later that afternoon he drove to his attorney's office. Slamming the thick stack of documents onto the polished desk, his lawyer leaned forward, his eyes sharp as he flipped through page after page. Shaking his head slowly, "This isn't just a civil matter anymore. This is forgery, fraud, and attempted theft on a massive scale. Karen has no idea what kind of fire she just lit for herself." The man's voice was steady, his anger controlled but strong. "She thinks she can bully me. She thinks she can twist the law like it's another HOA fine. But this is my land, and she just signed her own downfall." The lawyer smiled thinly, tapping the papers with his finger. "We'll build the case piece by piece, we'll file motions, and when the judge sees this, she won't be able to laugh her way out of it." The man leaned back in his chair, staring out the office window at the city below, his thoughts racing. He knew Karen was probably already boasting to the board, telling them she had trapped him, that the farmland was as good as gone. But what she didn't know was that every lie she wrote was now another weapon in his hands. Every forged signature another nail in her coffin. He left the office with a sense of grim determination, the sun setting behind him as he drove back toward the farm, his truck rattling over the gravel road, the fields stretching wide and silent. He stood at the edge of his land, staring out across the acres, the soil dark and rich, the barns sturdy against the evening sky. He clenched his fists, whispering to himself, "This is mine, and she's going to pay for every inch she tried to steal." Karen's voice echoed across the clubhouse that weekend, loud and full of arrogance as neighbors gathered for what she called a victory celebration. Balloons were tied at the entrance, tables filled with snacks and drinks lined the walls, and she stood at the center like a queen hosting a coronation. The man watched from a distance, leaning against the doorway, his arms crossed, his jaw clenched. Karen raised her glass and announced loudly, "Ladies and gentlemen, the HOA has achieved something historic. We have secured ownership of 3,200 acres of land that will expand our community into something greater. Soon we'll have new developments, new homes, new parks. This will bring prestige and value to all of us." Cheers rose from the crowd, though many clapped hesitantly, their eyes darting toward the man at the door. Karen noticed him but only smiled wider, her voice dripping with mockery. "And of course, our dear neighbor here will just have to adjust to change. Sometimes progress requires sacrifice." Laughter spread through the hall, though it sounded forced. Some neighbors exchanged uneasy looks, not entirely convinced by her show. The man stayed quiet, his eyes locked on her, every word searing into his memory. He pulled out his phone and discreetly hit record, capturing every boast, Every lie, every self-incriminating sentence, Karen strutted about, shaking hands, accepting congratulations like a politician, repeating again and again how the farmland was now the HOA's greatest achievement. Outside, the man walked into the cool night, the recording saved safely in his phone. His anger was deep, but deeper still was his patience, because now he had her arrogance on tape, proof that she was claiming ownership without legal grounds. The next day he continued to dig, combing through old deeds and maps late into the night, finding more and more evidence that his family's land had been legally separate from the HOA's jurisdiction from the very beginning. Tucked away in an old box he found a map signed by county surveyors decades ago, the boundaries clear, his farmland outlined boldly while the subdivision sat far outside its limits. He traced the lines with his finger, a smile tugging at his lips. Karen's lies were collapsing under the weight of history itself. Meanwhile Karen grew bolder, sending out glossy flyers across the community with her picture printed proudly. HOA secures new lands. A bright future ahead, it read. In bold letters, neighbors whispered as they read it, some impressed, others skeptical. One woman muttered to her friend, "How could she really take all that land? It doesn't sound right." But Karen didn't care. She basked in the illusion of power, confident that the man was cornered. But every day while she paraded her false victory, he was quietly building a case that would not only destroy her lies but strip her of everything she thought she controlled. He stacked the documents higher, filled binders with proof, transcripts, photographs, certified records, each piece a nail in the coffin Karen had built for herself. Standing on his porch one evening, he looked out at the dark fields stretching endlessly before him, the silence of the land calming his fury. He whispered to himself, "Celebrate while you can, Karen, because soon enough you won't just lose what you tried to steal, you'll lose everything you thought you owned." The man knew the time for silence was ending. Days of watching Karen boast and lie had filled his folder with proof. But proof meant nothing if it stayed locked in his house. So he decided to strike back in a way that would leave her shaken. He prepared carefully, scanning every deed, every survey map, every receipt his family had preserved for generations. He organized them into binders, labeling each section so there would be no confusion. He even enlarged the old county maps onto poster boards, highlighting the bold lines that showed his farmland had never been under HOA jurisdiction. The night before the next HOA meeting he barely slept, pacing the floor of his farmhouse. His anger cooled into sharp determination. He wasn't just fighting for land anymore, he was fighting for justice, for the name of his family, for every neighbor who had been crushed under Karen's petty fines and bullying. The next evening he walked into the community hall with his arms full of binders and boards. The room fell silent as people turned, their eyes wide at the sight of him carrying his evidence like a soldier carrying weapons into battle. Karen was already at the front, smirking as usual, her voice loud, "Welcome everyone. Tonight we'll continue our exciting plans for development on our newly acquired farmland." Applause rippled through the crowd though weaker than before. The man stepped forward and slammed the binders onto the front table, the sound echoing like a gavel itself. Karen flinched but quickly forced a smile. "And what is this spectacle supposed to be?" she asked with a mocking laugh. The man's voice cut through the room, low but steady. "This is the truth you've been hiding from everyone." He flipped open the first binder and held up the enlarged map, his finger tracing the bold black line. "This is the county survey from 30 years ago. It shows the boundaries clear as daylight. My farmland is here. The subdivision is here. 2 separate properties, 2 separate jurisdictions. Your HOA has no claim. Not now, not ever." The room stirred, neighbors leaning forward, squinting at the maps, murmuring among themselves. Karen slammed her gavel against the table. "This meeting is not the place for your theatrics. Sit down before I have you removed." But her voice cracked at the edges. He ignored her, pulling out the second binder, flipping through pages with sharp movements. "Here are the deeds, notarized and sealed by the county, dating back to when my grandfather bought this land. Not one signature missing, not one flaw in ownership. And here," he pulled out the HOA's so-called documents, holding them up high. "Here are the forgeries you filed, with my name scribbled in handwriting that isn't mine, dates that don't match, and stamps that anyone can see are false." Gasps filled the hall. Neighbors stood from their chairs, some whispering angrily. One older man shouted, "That's fraud, plain and simple." Karen's smile shattered, her face reddened. She shouted back, "Lies, all lies. He's twisting this to make himself look innocent. Don't be fooled." But her words sounded hollow. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, pressing play on the recording from her victory party. Her own voice rang out through the speakers. "We have secured ownership of his land, thanks to my leadership." The room erupted, neighbors pointing, some gasping, others shaking their heads in disgust. Her own words had betrayed her. Karen lunged forward, shouting, "You can't use that, you're not allowed." But she was drowned out by the angry murmurs of her own community. The man leaned closer, his eyes locked on hers, his voice low so only she could hear. "This is only the beginning, Karen. Next time it won't be a meeting you're embarrassed in, it'll be a courtroom." She froze, her breath shallow, her hands trembling slightly though she tried to hide it. And for the first time in months he saw fear in her eyes. The room buzzed with tension. The neighbors no longer united behind her, cracks spreading in her empire. He gathered his binders calmly, tucking them under his arm, and walked out of the hall, leaving Karen standing pale and cornered, her gavel limp in her hand, the whispers following him out into the night. The first signs that the neighborhood was turning against her. The summons arrived 2 weeks later, crisp white paper with the seal of the county court stamped on top. The man sat at his kitchen table and read every word. Slowly, Karen had officially pushed the fight into the courtroom. The HOA filing a civil suit claiming full ownership of his farmland. His stomach tightened but his hands stayed steady. Because this was exactly where he wanted the fight to go. No more gossip, no more flyers, no more empty speeches in the meeting hall. Now everything would be in front of a judge where truth and evidence mattered. He picked up the thick folder he had built, binders of maps, deeds, receipts, certified copies, and the recording of Karen bragging about stealing his land, each piece neatly labeled and ready. When the day of the hearing came, the courthouse buzzed with tension. Neighbors filled the back rows, some curious, some supportive, others hoping to see Karen win so they could benefit from the land grab. Karen arrived dressed like she was attending a gala, pearls around her neck, her heels clicking confidently across the marble floor. Her lawyer walked beside her carrying stacks of papers. She smiled smugly at the man as if she had already won, but he simply met her gaze with calm eyes and walked past without a word. Inside the courtroom the air grew thick as the judge entered, her gavel striking sharply. Karen's lawyer stood first, his voice loud, "Your Honor, the HOA has the right under community bylaws to regulate all property within its reach. The defendant has repeatedly violated standards and refused compliance. Therefore ownership has been transferred to the association for the good of the community." He spread Karen's forged documents across the judge's bench as if they were gospel. The man's lawyer rose slowly, his voice calm but cutting, "Your Honor, what the plaintiff presents is not law, it is fraud. Here are the real documents." He laid down the certified deeds, maps, and survey records, each stamped and notarized by the county. This farmland was purchased decades before the HOA existed. The boundaries are clear, the ownership is clear, and these signatures the HOA submitted are forgeries, crude imitations of my client's name. He held up the two documents side by side, the false shaky signature against the bold original. The difference undeniable. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Karen's face reddened but she sat stiff, her chin high. The judge leaned forward, adjusting her glasses. "Mrs. Wright, how do you explain this discrepancy?" Karen stood suddenly, her voice sharp. "His lying, Your Honor, his twisting everything. The land is wasted under him. We need it for the good of the community. The signatures are real, he just regrets signing them." Her words cracked at the edges, desperation leaking through. The man's lawyer pressed play on the recording, Karen's own voice filling the courtroom. "We have secured ownership of his land, thanks to my leadership." Gasps filled the room, some neighbors in the back whispering furiously, others shaking their heads. The judge's eyes narrowed, her tone icy. "Mrs. Wright, this recording clearly shows intent to claim ownership without legal authority. Combined with these forged documents, this case begins to look less like a civil dispute and more like fraud." Karen's lawyer fumbled with his papers, muttering weak excuses. "It was a misunderstanding, Your Honor, a misfiling, nothing malicious." But the judge cut him off. "Misfiling does not create forged signatures. Counselor." The man sat quietly at the defense table, his heart steady. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply let the weight of truth crush the lies around him. Karen gripped the table, her knuckles white, her eyes darting desperately around the courtroom. But she could see it in the faces of the neighbors behind her. The tide had turned. The empire she built on arrogance and fear was crumbling in front of everyone. and the fight she thought she had already won was slipping completely out of her hands. The courtroom grew heavier as the hearing stretched into the afternoon. The judge called for more evidence and the man's lawyer calmly delivered binder after binder, each filled with certified deeds, tax records, and maps marked with county seals, every piece cutting deeper into the lies Karen had built. The neighbors sitting in the back leaned forward in their seats, their whispers no longer siding with her but questioning how she thought she could get away with something so brazen. Karen sat rigid at the plaintiff's table, her smile gone, her hands trembling slightly though she tried to hide them beneath the papers. Her lawyer rose again, his voice sharper now. Your Honor, while the defense has produced documents, the HOA bylaws still give us authority to regulate all property connected to the community. The land may not be inside the neighborhood, but its presence impacts the image and safety of our homes. Surely that must hold weight. The judge's eyes narrowed. Her tone clipped. Counselor, bylaws are not stronger than state law, and they do not extend jurisdiction over land that was never part of your community. You are stretching an argument that has no ground. Karen jumped to her feet suddenly, her voice cracking. But it should be ours, Your Honor. He doesn't deserve it. He doesn't even use it properly. He lets it rot when it could bring homes, money, growth. I did this for everyone here. Her words echoed desperate and shrill. The judge's gavel struck once, silencing her. Sit down, Mrs. Wright. This is not about what you want. This is about the law, and so far you have shown nothing but questionable documents and reckless claims. Gasps rippled through the room. Karen's face flushed red as she sank back down, her lawyer whispering harshly at her. But her eyes flicked toward the man, burning with a mixture of hatred and fear. The man remained still, his gaze calm, his hands folded on the table, never raising his voice, never breaking composure. His patience only made her look smaller, weaker. The judge asked the defense for closing arguments. The man's lawyer stood tall, his voice steady but strong. Your Honor, this case is not about community improvement. It is about theft, plain and simple. The HOA, led by Mrs. Wright, attempted to forge documents, spread lies, and seize land that does not and never has belonged to them. My client has endured harassment, defamation, and an attempt to strip him of the legacy his family built across generations. This court must not only dismiss their claims but recognize the harm they have caused. The judge nodded slowly, making notes, her expression unreadable but firm. The room buzzed with tension. The verdict was close. Karen's foot tapped rapidly beneath the table, her breathing uneven, sweat glistening at her temple. She looked nothing like the queen who once ruled over every neighbor with fear. Now she looked like a desperate woman clinging to the last threads of control. The man sat in silence, his heart steady, knowing the walls were closing in on her, and soon the gavel would come down with the sound of justice she could not escape. The courtroom was silent when the judge returned after a short recess, her robe flowing as she stepped back onto the bench. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. Every whisper in the room died instantly. Karen sat stiff in her chair, her lips pressed so tightly they had gone pale. Her lawyer leaned toward her, whispering frantic last-minute words, but her eyes never left the judge. The man sat calm, his folder closed, his hands resting on the table, his breathing steady. He had brought every proof, every deed, every recording, and now all that was left was judgment. The judge adjusted her glasses and began, her voice firm and unwavering. This court has carefully reviewed the evidence presented by both parties. The plaintiff, the HOA represented by Mrs. Wright, has failed to establish any legitimate authority over the farmland in question. The documents they submitted contain forged signatures, inconsistent dates, and are not legally valid. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Neighbors exchanged shocked glances, some covering their mouths. The judge's tone grew sharper. Furthermore, the recording presented by the defense clearly demonstrates Mrs. Wright's intent to claim ownership of land without any legal basis. This constitutes not only harassment but an attempt at fraudulent seizure. Karen's face crumpled, her body stiff as stone. Her lawyer tried to rise but the judge silenced him with a glare. Sit down, counselor. This court is not blind to the facts. The man remained still, his eyes locked on the judge, his chest rising and falling with quiet control. The judge continued. Therefore, the HOA's claim to the 3,200 acres is hereby dismissed in full, and ownership remains solely with the defendant, whose deeds and records have been verified and are indisputable. The gavel struck again, the sound booming, but the judge wasn't finished. Her voice grew heavier. In addition Due to the fraudulent actions taken, the damage done to the defendant's reputation, and the stress caused by this harassment, this court orders Mrs. Wright and the HOA to pay restitution in the amount of $350,000. The room erupted, shocked gasps, some even clapping before quickly silencing themselves. Neighbors whispered loudly now, $350,000. She's finished. Karen's hands shot up, her voice shrill. No. This can't be. I did it for the community. He doesn't deserve that land. You can't do this to me. The judge slammed the gavel hard, the sound like thunder. Enough, Mrs. Wright. This is a court of law, not your personal stage. You have abused your authority. You have lied. And now you face the consequences. Karen sank back into her chair, tears of fury filling her eyes. Her lawyer slumped beside her, defeated. The man rose slowly, his movements calm. Gathering his folder, he did not gloat, did not smile. He simply nodded once at the judge in quiet respect before turning to leave. The crowd parted as he walked down the aisle, whispers following him. He won, she's ruined, the land is safe. Outside the courthouse the sunlight was bright, almost blinding. He took a deep breath, the weight of months of lies and battles finally lifting. Behind him Karen stumbled out of the doors, her perfect image shattered, her voice breaking as she screamed at her board members. But no one followed her, no one supported her. She stood alone in the middle of the steps, a woman who had lost everything. The man stepped into his truck, his eyes drifting toward the horizon where his farmland stretched wide and free, untouched, unbroken, still his, and as the engine rumbled to life he whispered to himself, "It's over, and justice won." The news spread faster than wildfire. By the next morning every corner of the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Karen had lost. The court had not only thrown out her fraudulent claims but ordered her and the HOA to pay $350,000. Neighbors who once nodded politely to her now crossed the street to avoid her. The proud queen of the subdivision was reduced to a shadow hiding behind closed blinds. The man sat on his porch sipping coffee, his gaze sweeping over the farmland that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. For the first time in weeks his chest felt lighter. His land was safe, the legacy of his family intact. But the true satisfaction came from knowing Karen's reign of fear was finally broken. At the local grocery store whispers followed her like ghosts. She thought she could steal 3,000 acres, one woman muttered. Now she can't even pay her own fines. Another laughed softly. The judge crushed her. She's done. Children who once avoided her now rode their bikes past her house shouting and laughing, no longer afraid of her sharp voice barking orders about chalk drawings or uncut grass. The man kept his head down, never bragging, never throwing his victory in anyone's face. But his silence carried more weight than any speech. Neighbors began stopping by his porch, some apologizing quietly for doubting him, others offering firm handshakes and words of respect. "You fought the fight we all wished we could," one man said. "She's been bullying us for years, and you stood up to her." He nodded, offering only a small smile, because he knew the real victory wasn't just in keeping his land. It was in freeing the community from her chokehold. Karen's house became a symbol of her downfall. The once pristine lawn grew ragged, her flowers wilted. The porch where she once stood with clipboards and threats now stood empty, envelopes piled on her doorstep, likely bills and letters from the court. Neighbors gossiped that the HOA board had collapsed, most members resigning rather than face the shame of being tied to her. The association's power was gone, reduced to nothing more than a bitter memory. One evening the man walked the edge of his farmland, the air cool, the fields calm under the fading sun. He breathed deeply, remembering his grandfather's words about protecting what was yours, about never bending to thieves no matter how powerful they seemed. He smiled faintly, whispering, "It's still ours, it always will be." As he turned back toward his farmhouse he saw neighbors gathered at the end of the road, waving, some even clapping softly as he passed. He didn't wave back but he dipped his head, their gratitude clear enough. And though Karen still hid in her house, curtains drawn tight, she could not escape the sound of her community moving on without her. Her name now spoken not with fear but with pity and disgust. The man climbed his porch steps, looking out over the darkening fields, the silence of victory surrounding him. Justice had been served, his land restored, and the HOA that tried to steal everything left in ruins. And in that quiet moment he knew one thing for certain. No one would ever dare challenge him or his land again.